Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This video, I'm completing the last page of section 3 in my medical ethics notes. It's on page 9 of my notes. As you guys know, just download the notes by clicking the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. I've recently updated it. Again, this is the tail end of section 3, page 9 of my notes. The reason being, section 3 up until this point exceeded an hour, so I wanted to make sure that I can give a full discussion to this section without having to rush through. So we're still on section 3, page 9. It's just about a half a page worth of notes. We're going to be using this Classic Works in Medical Ethics book, so make sure that you have the book to follow along. As you guys always know, my lectures are always a means of supplementing existing information. I don't expect this to supplant the reading, but to supplement the reading. So make sure you get the book, make sure you do the reading, and then watch the series in order to facilitate a more in-depth understanding of what it is that you've read. So with that, let's begin. Section 3. Again, page 9 in my notes. So this is medical ethics. Section. And again, this is just the last page of the notes. I didn't want to rush. So if you look at the top of page 9, it begins with a quote. And remember, the content of the section is on suicide. So we're going to end the analysis and discussion on suicide with this last half page. So, quote, "Thus, if I am working with a person, one limitation I would put on his right to suicide would be that his assessment of his life situation be realistic as I see it." As you guys remember from the last section, it's important to realize arguably one of the difficulties in the assessment and the analysis and discussion of suicide, because there is a recognized right to suicide, right? So that the institution recognizes a right to suicide, right? The institution recognizes a right to suicide, right? But in terms of the recognition of that right, the recognition requires a realistic assessment of one's life situation, right? So that the motivation for suicide, as I said in my last section, isn't, well, I think that my body is going to, once I kill myself, be transported via some comet to another world, right? Someone would say that that's a bit delusional, that justification for suicide isn't realistic. But there's a problem, right? There's a problem with this idea of recognition, institutional recognition. The idea of this institutional recognition is contingent on institutional recognition from psychology, from psychiatry, is itself, according to the author, contingent on the therapist's realistic life assessment of the patient, right? How realistic is this individual's life assessment, right? So let's just read that quote again. "Thus, I am working with a person, if I am working with a person, one limitation I would put on his right to suicide," so we're talking about limiting that right, "would be that his assessment of his life situation be realistic as I see it." Right? The inherent problem that arises in the attempt to limit, an individual's recognized right to suicide pertains to the subjective nature of the realistic life assessment. Right? The realistic life assessment is itself contingent to subjectivity, right? It's how the therapist interprets the realistic life assessment that the patient's making, right? If I am going to both say that I recognize a right to suicide, and I'm going to say that that right is contingent on an assessment, right, which justifies the right, well, we have a little bit of problem insofar as the assessment is subjective, right? This assessment right? The problem is that this assessment is subjective. It's a subjective assessment, right? So that's the point. So now let's read the critique right underneath that, top of page 9. There's a huge conceptual obligation which requires a very precise justification for a medical practitioner's ability to limit a right they themselves acknowledge and recognize, right? There's a huge conceptual obligation and justification, very precise justification that you'll be required to utilize if you're going to limit that individual's right. Is a self-referential appeal meaningful, right? So the idea is, this idea of being self-referential is that the therapist recognizes the right, but wants to, as the author says, limit the exercise of that right. Though I recognize the fact that you have a right to suicide, insofar as the individual potential patient is exercising his or her own personal autonomy, I also am attempting to limit you in convincing you, in persuading you not to exercise the right that you have. That's the whole point, arguably, that the patient came to therapy, right? Hey, this is what I've been thinking, and the therapist says, well, you know, here's why you shouldn't do it, and so on and so on. Again, I'm not a therapist, so I'm not going to situate the discourse in terms of therapy, but logically, what's important is to recognize the complexity of both the recognition of a right and simultaneously the attempt to limit the exercise of that right. Right? That's the specific tension that I want to highlight. So let me read this section on page 69 of the book. Again, please make sure you have the book so that you can follow along. It's sort of don't take my word for it. All right? So let me read 69. Explain the distinction between rational suicide and realistic of life assessment. Okay, so let me read this. Do I come back to 69? No. Okay. Once I get my pen in there. So this is the second to last paragraph. The paragraph begins a related concept, if you're following along, and it's about 2 sentences down. According to one contemporary philosopher, quote, the degree of rationality of the suicidal act would depend on the degree of rationality of the philosophy which was guiding the person's deliberation. Basically all that's saying is your rational justification for your own suicide is potentially itself justified by a philosophy which exercises and demonstrates and legitimizes personal autonomy. The rationality of your act, potential act, is itself then contingent on the rationality of the justification that legitimizes the act, right? So that this is a bit complicated, but we have the individual and the right to suicide, right? The right to suicide, RTS, right to suicide. This is justified, this right to suicide is justified, this right to suicide is justified by an appeal. Right? This right to suicide is justified by an appeal. Where is the appeal? The appeal is based on, I guess, I want to use the exact words that he says. Guy's personal decision. Rationality is defined in terms of the problem. So, according to contemporary philosophers, the degree of rationality of suicide depends on the degree of rationality of the philosophy which was guiding, right? We'll just put guiding philosophy. Right? So, the individual's right to suicide is justified by an appeal to this guiding philosophy. This guiding philosophy is going to legitimize, right? This guiding philosophy legitimizes the individual's right to suicide. So I say that I have a right to suicide. And if I needed to justify to someone externally why I think I am justified in exercising my right to kill myself, I would have to make an appeal.